Whether you're a kid on the playground picking sides and defending it to the death, or in your teenage years spending most of your time in the arcade, you know Sega. For you youngins who mostly know Sega as Sonic's daddy, strap in. Bebop and Dangerous. About to teach you a lesson.
So chief, kiss the return of the blade and slice shade, getting paid into my silhouette fades, immersing.
You see, most people would assume that Sega is a Japanese company, much like Nintendo, but that isn't the case. Standard Games was founded by American businessmen Martin Bromley, Irving Bromberg, and James Humpert. Standard Games was founded in Hawaii as a response to the demand for entertainment following World War II. After the war, the company was sold and the name was changed to Service Games. The company established Service Games of Japan to provide coin-operated slot machines to the US bases in Japan. The company expanded over the next 7 years to include distribution in South Korea, the Philippines, and South Vietnam. The name Sega wasn't even used until 1945, on the Diamond Star machine. Service Games of Japan was dissolved on May 31st, 1960. So that's it, that's the history of Sega. You just hallucinated the 90s. Only a week or so later, original founder Martin Bromley established two smaller companies to basically continue Service Games' business by buying out all of its assets. David Rosen, an American officer in the United States Air Force stationed in Japan, launched a 2-minute photo booth business in Tokyo in 1954. This company became Rosen Enterprises, and in 1957 began importing coin-operated games to Japan. In 1965, Bromley's companies acquired Rosen Enterprises to form Sega Enterprises Ltd. This is the start of the Sega that we know today. Sega released Pongtron, their first video-based game in 1973. It didn't do too well, mainly because its main competition at the time was a little game called Space Invaders. Anyways, this was Sega's foray into video games, and as the 70s turned into the 80s, Sega would slowly morph into the company we recognize today. The video game crash of 1983 reared its ugly head in North America, and this caused Sega's parent company at the time, Gulf and Western, to sell its North American arcade manufacturing organization and the licensing rights for its arcade games, only retaining the North American R&D division and the Japanese subsidiary. Remember this because it becomes important later. With its arcade business in decline, Sega Enterprises President Nakayama advocated that the company leverages its hardware expertise to move into the home console market in Japan, which was in its infancy at the time. This led to Sega's development of a computer, the SC-3000. Upon finding out that Nintendo was developing a game-only console, Sega developed and released its first home video game system, the SG-1000. By this time, Nintendo was starting to get into bed with third-party developers, which guaranteed that their Famicom would have a decent library of games. Shortly after the launch of the SG-1000, Gulf and Western began to divest its secondary businesses, so Nakayama and Rosen arranged a management buyout of the Japanese subsidiary in 1984. This is when Sega became Japanese. Soon after, Sega released the SG-1000 Mark II, or to the rest of the world, the Sega Master System. It did okay. It did amazing in South America, but it did lay the foundation for Sega's next console, the Sega Mega Drive, or to us Yanks, the Sega Genesis. This is the classic Sega that we all know and love. Sega had to go directly after its competition, Nintendo, which had already found its success after marketing the NES as a toy and not a video game console. Yeah, video games became a dirty word in the United States after 1983. Since its launch in late 1985, the NES and subsequently Nintendo as a company had a reputation for being family-friendly. Sega took notice and marketed the Genesis for an older audience, edgy teenagers, to kids who were buying And Justice for All on CD at Sam Goody on their skateboards. The Genesis was also a much more powerful machine, so Sega's home ports of arcade games were a huge selling point. This edgy antithesis to Nintendo's squeaky clean reputation would come to fruition with Sonic the Hedgehog on June 23rd, 1991. One thing Sega didn't really have was any sort of identifiable brand or mascot. Disney had Mickey Mouse, Warner Brothers had Bugs Bunny, and Nintendo had Mario. With Nintendo announcing the successor to the NES, the Super Nintendo, Sega needed to think fast. Internal design competition, up-and-coming game developer Yuji Naka, and a few tweaks from Sega of America birthed Sonic the Hedgehog to all the little boys and girls in the riskiest move ever. Sega bundled the game for free with the Genesis at launch. It of course was the huge success that we all know and love, and refuses to go away, and gives us things like this.
Meow.
But in all seriousness, let me take a step back and kind of quantify just how good Sega was doing at the time. Sonic was more recognizable to young children than Mickey Mouse. Sega for the first time got Nintendo to do what they seemingly never do, and that's panic. It was around this time that parents and political groups alike started to, shall we say, grow concerns about violent video games. Sega being at the forefront mainly due to its edgier, older marketing, Mortal Kombat and Night Trap being the two games in question. Just to put that into perspective, this is what Night Trap looked like.
Oh, it's not over yet, my little darling. No! How could this happen?
And this is what the new Mortal Kombat looks like. We've come a long way. The biggest draw between Sega and Nintendo being that the version of Mortal Kombat on the Genesis had blood and the Super Nintendo version did not. This was also Nintendo's big jab at Sega at that hearing, which, needless to say, Sega isn't very good at defending itself. This of course prompted the creation of the ESRB. Sega's other big battle with Nintendo was the race to make their existing console more powerful. The Super Nintendo, being 2 years newer than the Sega Genesis, was the more powerful machine. So Sega dropped the Sega CD in 1991. Nintendo then scrambled to embrace CD technology as well, initially with Sony with a device dubbed the PlayStation. 2 words. Nintendo, in a case of whoops, we accidentally gave them the rights to all of our games, pulled out at the last minute and negotiated a deal with Philips. This of course pissed Sony off. And well...
$2.99.
Sega was now in a position to experiment. They had to one-up Nintendo at every opportunity they could to overcome Nintendo's monopoly at the time. This is part of what made Sega so interesting. They literally did what Nintendo didn't. Sega released so many offbeat and varied consoles and handhelds just in an attempt to get a leg up over Nintendo. Genesis and Sega CD combos like the Genesis CDX and the Victor Wonder Mega, to add-ons for Laserdisc players to play Genesis games. Sega even had a portable Genesis with the Sega Nomad. God, the Game Boy at the time had a green screen. Meanwhile, the Sega gave you a whole-ass Genesis on the go. This overambition was Sega's downfall, unfortunately. Remember Sony from earlier? Yeah, they started to get into the video game market, and Nintendo was getting ready to launch the N64, one of my favorite video game systems of all time. Sega was prepping the launch of the Sega Saturn, which was already plagued with issues. The system was difficult to develop for, unlike the PlayStation, but the problems really didn't surface until it became time to release the system in the US. Sega released the 32X on November 21st, 1994 in North America at half the price of the Sega Saturn. It, like the Saturn, was also 32-bit. In March 1995, Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske announced that the Saturn would be released in the US on Saturn Day, September 2nd, 1995. However, Sega of Japan mandated an early launch to give the Saturn an advantage over the PlayStation. At the first ever E3 in Los Angeles on May 11th, 1995, Kalinske gave a keynote presentation in which he revealed the release price of $399 and described the features of the console. Kalinske also revealed that, due to high consumer demand, Sega had already shipped 30,000 Saturns to Toys R Us, Babbage's, and Electronics Boutique for immediate release. This of course made retailers like Walmart, Best Buy, and KB Toys very mad. KB Toys going as far as to drop Sega from their lineup. This also pissed off developers. EA refused to develop for Sega after that. All of this was a bad start, but certainly recoverable. Unfortunately, it doesn't take much to lose momentum.
$2.99.
Bernie Stoller, a former executive at Sony Computer Entertainment of America, was named Sega of America's Executive Vice President in charge of product development and third-party relations, noting the difficulty to develop for the hardware. He also was opposed to the idea of bringing JRPGs to the system, noting that Americans didn't like JRPGs. Then literally right after he said that, Final Fantasy VII came out. Anyways, even after all of that, Sega didn't have any real Sonic games for the system. Sonic Extreme was well into development for the system, but after internal disputes about game engines and Yuji Naka almost dying, the game was cancelled. The games we did get were a Genesis port, a compilation with a 3D overworld, and Sonic R. And we all know how much you guys love that one. Despite all that, from 1993 to 1996, Sega still had the highest share of the market with 38% compared to Nintendo's 30 and Sony's 24. However, with the Nintendo 64 launching in 1996 and the PlayStation outselling the Saturn 3-1 in 1997, Sega fell really quickly and really hard. And of course, Sega did as Sega does. Just 1 year later in 1998 and the following year for the rest of the world, Sega launched the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast was a huge jump ahead from anything on the market, basically running the exact same hardware as the arcades at the time. The US launch felt like something really special. 9/9/99 was a date etched into everyone's minds. It launched with what was the most ambitious Sonic game to date. Sega had managed to completely turn themselves around from Saturn and even learned to survive without developers like EA. I already made a video gushing over the Sega Dreamcast and why it's the best thing ever. It was inventive, it was fun, it was innovative, and it felt like a great bookend for the 1990s. However, it's all in the timing. Unfortunately, as well as Sega was doing, they simply could not compete with the Sony PlayStation 2 a year later. Sega announced that it was going to stop manufacturing hardware in 2001 and become a third-party developer. In 2003, the company was bought by Sammy Corporations, and the company, other than Sonic, looks a whole lot different. Sega is still around and doing alright, and they're at least throwing a bone to their classic franchises every now and then. The truth is, Sega shaped an industry. Sega practically laid the foundation for Microsoft in the US. They kept Nintendo from monopolizing the industry, and for that, the industry grew. They innovated, not only in arcades, but in the home. And even outside of that, culturally they defined the 90s. They were different. At times weird, but Sega definitely had a style. You could look at any screenshot from any game and immediately tell that it was a Sega game. They were the underdogs. They're not one of the big three anymore. But since the beginning, they struggled to find their stride. Seeing a company that started off with simple coin-op machines beating out a century-old dominant toy company turned video game company, even just for a moment, is the best underdog story of all time. So what do you think? What are some of your favorite memories from Sega when you were growing up? Were you a Nintendo or a Sega kid? Truthfully, I think most of us were both because we either had friends or family that had one or the other. If you haven't heard, we have shirts. And they're really cute and they're cool. This one's inspired by Fully Cooley and Adult Swim. And that's kind of 90s, early 2000s. If you are in Miami, June 29th, we will be throwing a 90s themed industry mixer / open bar extravaganza. $15. Come in, enjoy some local art, get crunk to 90s tunes, and get extremely turnt because it is open bar all night. Dennis, I apologize in advance, but I love you. If you haven't yet, don't forget to like, comment, favorite, and subscribe. As always, I'm your boy Mike Dangerous, and this was Talking Shots.